Greetings everyone. It's October 25th, 2009. My name is Larry Williams and I'm the Director of the Center for the Advancement of Research Methods and Analysis, or CARMA, here at Virginia Commonwealth University. And we're here today to chat with Dr. Jeremy Short from Texas Tech University as part of our Meet the Methodologist program. Jeremy is here to do a webcast later today on computer-aided text analysis. So we're going to learn a little bit about Jeremy and his interests. So Jeremy, thank you for taking the time from your schedule to come. So why don't you begin by just sharing with us a little bit about how you got interested in research methods?
Well, I think for me, when I started LSU in my doctoral program, I knew that was really an area of weakness that I needed to work on. So I remember right before when I moved to Baton Rouge, I picked up two statistics books. One was, I think, Barron's Guide to Statistics 101 kind of book, sort of a Cliff Note type book, and the other one was Larry Gonick's Cartoon Guide to Statistics. So I knew it was an area that was important for research, to understand research methods that I was deficient in. So that's really what started that interest, and I just really carried that through. And when I was at LSU, I was also encouraged by a lot of folks to become excellent in research methods whenever possible.
And so as part of your graduate training, do you have a particular favorite course on research methods that you took, and if so, why that one?
There were a lot of classes I really enjoyed. Probably, and it's difficult because there were many great classes at LSU, but probably the one that stands out that I enjoyed the most was Bill Black's class, and he literally wrote one of the most well-cited books on basic multivariate stats. And so I learned a lot from his class, learned a lot about how to practically apply those to methods and strategy, and that's just one that he was an excellent teacher that stood out as one particular one. Yeah.
Well, as best you can remember, were there any particular challenges you faced in learning about research methods or statistics as a graduate student?
Challenges, that's a good question. I think the two classes stood out as being pretty difficult because they had a lot of matrix algebra, and I think some early sort of second year regression type classes had a lot of that, and as well when I first learned elements of structural equation modeling, we actually did the computational formulas before there was so much point and click statistics. So those were challenging, I think, in terms of getting up to speed. Yeah. Fortunately, I was able to avoid large amounts of calculus, but I think that was probably two of the specific courses that I think of. I think in general it's just getting caught up to the state of the art because it's always changing in research methods. And just when you think you learn a technique, there's 10 or 12 articles telling you that it's been done wrong for a decade in your area of research, and there's some new twist that you need to learn on it. So I think the lifelong learning process is always a challenge as well.
Yeah. Well, Jeremy, you've had a lot of experience since you left your graduate program at LSU. Experience as a reviewer for research methods papers and strategy substantive papers, and I'm wondering whether you could comment for our viewers on what you see as some of the most frequent limitations or shortcomings in these papers.
I think two main issues, and I remember there was an article by Daft in the Frost and Cummings book, Why I Reject Your Article and What You Can Do About It, and then the two of those issues still really resonate with me of why I or reviewers recommend rejecting manuscripts. And probably the first primary reason is just the quality of writing. The details that need to be reported aren't reported. The clarity really at the sentence level is not there. I read many papers and I think to myself, I honestly have no idea what the person is trying to say at the sentence level. So I think there's the writings as an issue. The other one that tends to be a little bit more related to statistics and research methods is an area of fit. The fit between the hypotheses you're hoping to test or the construct you're hoping to measure and how you operationalize that, how you actually test that. And that's been criticized in the management field as a whole. It's been criticized in strategic management and entrepreneurship. And I think that continues to be sort of the main rejection challenge or issue that ends rejection. In terms of a very specific thing, if I was going to look at reviewing some papers that tend to be both micro and macro focused, I would say common method variance. If I was going to highlight one particular issue that just I'm surprised that it comes up a lot, it ends up being a reason for rejection, it would be that.
And so do you have a favorite research methods book that either influenced you greatly or upon which you rely regularly?
I would say, two books stick out. One's the Kurtlinger book, sort of more of a philosophy of science book, and then the Gare, Anderson, Tatham, Black, and they rotate authors a lot, but their Multivariate Stats book is one that's kind of a go-to for me to, just because I can understand it.
Yeah. So, Jeremy, if we kind of try to get you to step back from a big picture perspective, are there topical areas within the field of research methods for strategy that you think we are doing a particularly good or a particularly bad job of investigating?
Well, I think what we're doing is a relatively good job of, and what's really defined the strategy field is the idea of looking at firm performance, because we have measures that we can get from archival data sources that we know matter. We know stock price is important, or just going bankrupt or not. We know that's important, and the idea of looking at a balanced perspective of measures. And so I think we do a pretty good job on that. The difficulty is the measures that we know are important to us and important practitioners don't always line up very well in the way we might want to test something from a research methods perspective. So oftentimes stock market and, say, return on assets, a financial measure, are not necessarily very highly correlated. So the idea of having construct validity with our key dependent variables is difficult. In terms of an area that I've always found challenging, I wouldn't necessarily do a poor job, but it's something I've always been interested in trying to look at, but I think it's very difficult, is managers' cognitions and CEO cognitions. And that's just difficult because it's difficult to get access. We in strategy and a lot of us that like to use different research methods would like to have a pretty large sample size, and it's difficult to get survey data, so it's hard to get psychometric type measures. So we use other methods that we can try to tap into that, but there's always been this, I think, black box in strategy of looking at, say, a lot of work on top management teams where we might take a construct like CEO age or CEO tenure that might be far and away from really measuring CEO's decision-making abilities or CEO's thoughts or cognitions. So that's an area I find really interesting research, so I think that's why I would know the weaknesses of that area, and I think there's a lot of room to improve and move that field forward more.
Mm-hmm. Well, since you left Louisiana State, in addition to all this work reviewing, you've also been involved in research on several areas of research methods. And I was wondering if you could give us an overview of some of those topics so we can know a little bit more about your prior work.
My advice to most folks is, to the extent that you can learn basic multivariate methods. I know there's a book out called It's All Regression. I think that's a great starting point to understand basic multivariate methods, because really most everything builds on that in some way or another. In terms of, so I tried to start from that perspective. In terms of specific things that I've tried to hone in general, when I'm talking about an undergraduate strategy or strategy for doctoral students, it's always a function of two things. How can you be on par with your competitors, and then how can you differentiate yourself? So the on par with everyone is making sure you know those basic multivariate stats. And two areas that I've worked on to try to have a little bit of more knowledge is hierarchical linear modeling, to do multi-level models. It's very common in management research in general, but certainly in strategy and in entrepreneurship research. And we commonly might look at firm and industry level or individuals within firms. And the second one, what we're looking at today, is content analysis. I always found content analysis very interesting, the idea that we can look at a narrative text and get some idea of something about maybe the cognition. It may be a cognition. If you look at shareholder letters, we might jump or take a leap of faith and say it tells us something about CEO decision processes. If not, if we don't want to take that big of a leap of faith, it might tell us about CEO or organizational impression management. But it certainly tells us something, because most of us spend a lot of time looking at the words we choose when we write things, and I think organizational narratives reflect some of that decision process as well.
You mentioned some of the work you're going to be talking about today. Could you tell us a little bit about the origins of, and give us a summary of your research and organizational research methods?
And specific of what we're talking about today?
Yeah.
I think it really gets to an area that I always found interesting in strategy is research on decision making and looking at CEO biases, CEO cognitions. And as mentioned, it's a difficult area to tap into. So one way we can start to get closer, and by closer I mean we take an incremental step. We're closer looking at CEO cognitions, in my opinion, to look at a text or some organizational narrative than we are just measuring some very distant proxy like CEO age, CEO tenure. And that led me kind of early on to look at content analysis, this idea that we can look at the content of organizational narratives, commonly in strategy, or I guess really the two that I've always looked at have either been CEO shareholder letters or mission statements. So we can look at those statements and get some reflection about some organizational or individual characteristic. And in the micro side, I read a lot of research looking at how you would use content analysis to look at charismatic leadership and the language of charisma. And my own research, I looked at CEO letters and used that to examine how they might make comparisons to performance. So for example, if you look at the background of much of finance and microeconomics, there's this assumption that CEOs always compare to the market. They always compare to an external referent. But when we looked at shareholder letters, we found that most of the language would refer to previous year's performance, some internal measure. And that's interesting because, and why I like that type of research, and I think that hopefully moves the field forward, is in the past we would operationalize cognition in the strategy study by looking at some comparison to the industry. So we might just look at size or performance, some measure that's very far away from any way of tapping into any kind of cognition, and just assume that that's what CEOs did. It's very theoretically based in that sense. So I like the idea of content analysis where you're looking a little bit more at an organizational document, seeing exactly what they do. And meanwhile, since I started in this research, these documents are more highly scrutinized. Since Enron and many of the scandals, CEOs in the past, believe it or not, didn't really have to sign off that they even wrote these letters or had a whole lot to do with it. Now there's a lot more accountability. So I think they've really become almost better documents for looking at cognitions. And in terms of mission statements, at least with some of the mission statements that I've looked at that are colleges of business, now a big thing for AACSB accreditation is mission-linked accreditation. This idea that your mission statement should on some level matter. So it's looking at these documents, not taking a blind leap of faith that they tell us everything about a decision-making process or cognitive process, but they give us some insight, and I find that very interesting. It's not, I mean, I would definitely consider what I do to be a quantitative method, but it's more on the continuum of qualitative aspects than other methods might be out there.
Jeremy, I was wondering, we know that you're involved in an editorial capacity with two special types of projects related to research methods. One for the Journal of Management and one for organizational research methods. So I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, I'll start with the Journal of Management, because that's probably more fresh in my mind since we're still in process. And the idea, and this has been done before at AMJ and other journals, and I think it's a process that we're always working at, or certain folks in the field, to bridge gaps between what we would say is being micro and macro perspectives. Now, those terms are kind of arbitrary to start with. Some folks don't like to use micro versus macro. For us, it's a way to simplify how many people divide the field. So some of the papers look at methods contributions, but a lot of the papers in that Journal of Management issue are more boundary spanning perspective on substantive issues. Mm-hmm. So that's in process, and we're excited about that. And as you mentioned, a lot of folks, the other folks that are on the team are very well established in the methods area. Herman McGinnis, Chuck Pierce, Brian Boyd. So it's been fun to work with those guys and kind of glean from their insights. The second issue that will come out later is the Organization Research Methods project, looking at research methods and entrepreneurship. If I was to give an assessment of the field, historically, some of the stronger methods have come from what I would think of as the micro side, OB and HR, and psychometric type methods, psychology. And then strategy as a field has been a little bit behind that curve. In perspective, maybe way behind, but hopefully gaining ground. And entrepreneurship is kind of the latest cowboy on the block trying to make an impact substantively, is a little bit behind that. So what we wanted to do is get folks that are expert in research methods from different perspectives, but they were very insightful in terms of entrepreneurship to contribute to that special issue, and I'm looking forward to that coming out as well.
Two final questions, Jeremy, kind of more on a personal note. Do you do anything special to draw inspiration or motivation for your work?
That's a good question. In terms of, I think anything special, to me, the fun part of research is just thinking about how can I measure something, and I think that's what has led me a lot of times to content analysis. So the inspiration is just talking about something that I want to look at. I think one level of inspiration is just the newspaper. I think there's this feeling sometimes we have our academic research and journals, then we have our teaching that's maybe more tied to practice, and there's this large disconnect. So, in as much as I like to look at bridging micro and macro perspectives, I try to bridge my research and practice and elements of teaching and consulting and not create these big separate category silos. So I think a lot of inspiration is looking at the newspaper, and I think what drew me to this field and why I find management research interesting and a little bit more in the strategy area is you'll read the newspaper and think, wow, how did somebody make this decision? That in hindsight just seems to be a crazy, ridiculous decision. So I think part of the inspiration is to look at these decisions, understand them, deconstruct them, see what's going on, and I think that's always been sort of a source of inspiration of what makes this field fun for me.
Yeah. And finally, what are the least favorite and the most favorite parts of your work for you?
Well, I think that the most favorite part is working on these projects, coming up with ideas, building a team. I kind of like the data collection process, maybe not the minutia, the idea of thinking, oh, here's how we might create this large sample data set that's kind of unique. Oh, I can have some unique data to analyze. I think for me, the difficult part, or the least favorite part, is sort of the fine editing skills. I mentioned the reason I reject papers probably the most, and probably mine get rejected, or at least have to revise multiple times, is that attention to detail is so important. It's important in methods, it's important in your write-up, and I think that's sort of the 5% that makes your manuscript better that might take up 95% of your time. So going over the drafts many, many times, which I believe is necessary, sending out papers to peer review before you send to a journal, all of these process issues that are very time-consuming would be probably the less fun. The idea stage, when I'm just talking about what a great idea my paper is a lot more fun than actually have to write it and finish it.
Yep. All right. Well, Jeremy, we're very happy to have you here at CARMA, and we thank you for taking your time to share the comments, and we look forward to your webcast later today.
Well, thanks so much, Larry.
Yeah.